This is the first presentation in the Gymnosperms group of presentations, and this is the last unit that we'll be doing in dendrology. And I'm actually kind of sad that we're doing this group just purely over the computer remotely, because you should see some of the cones. And I have some huge cones from some of our western pines, and maybe hopefully I will have shown them to you before we left. I'll just have gotten them out, but if not, I apologize. So if you remember from our presentation earlier in the semester, where we talked about the numbers of different genera and species in the two different main categories. In the gymnosperm categories, there's only like 800 different species, so not that many. We're going to review a fair bit of them in these units. So we're going to cover Ginkgoaceae, the ginkgo family, Cupressaceae, cypress, just a few. There's a lot more that we're not necessarily getting to. There's going to be some genera that we don't cover. And then the Pinaceae family, the Pinaceae pine family. I'm going to cover Taxus, the yew family. We did go over these in the field, the common yew and the ornamental yew. Start with ginkgo, Ginkgoaceae, ginkgo biloba. And this is a really interesting tree. The genus is 250 million years old. All of the other species in the genus are extinct, so the only one that's left is ginkgo biloba. And this is a gymnosperm. It is not a conifer. It does not bear cones. So it predates the conifers. And it's not really clear how it fits into the phylogeny, where it fits in the family tree. So it's kind of an enigma. It's a neat plant. And this is a tree that was it's only found in cultivation. It's not found in the wild. And so it has been kept alive by humans, which is a really fascinating thing. So native to China, but planted worldwide. Since this tree is so old, it also doesn't have many pests, or any pests really at all. And so very few things eat the leaves or feed on the bark. And so it's a very durable tree to put in places pest-resistant plants. It likes moist, well-drained soils, disturbed areas, and it is a slow grower. And so even though it's used ornamentally, some people don't like it because it takes a long time before it really looks like something. In autumn, and they can have these very wide spreading canopies. It does have a main central trunk, like many gymnosperms do, so they have this fan-shaped leaves that are deciduous, and so they turn yellow in the fall and drop. Of the leaves, some of these aren't as bilobed, two-lobed as many of them. That one's like not lobed. But so they are also dioecious, where we have male trees and female trees. And the females have these large seeds that are covered in a fleshy, it's not really a fruit, it's technically not a fruit, but it's fruit-like. So this fleshy covering on the seed, and that fleshy covering is known for smelling bad. So it gets this reputation because it kind of smells a little bit like vomit, or kind of like baby poop. But inside are these large seeds, and the seeds are roasted and eaten by many cultures of people, especially from Asia. And the twigs are covered in spurs, and the leaves grow at the ends of the spurs along with the bud. There's the bark, this kind of flat-topped, interlacing bark, and it can be this kind of medium brown or almost a grayish color. It does have some uses. It's not listed here, but the wood is burned ceremonially by some religions. And I mentioned that the nuts are eaten. They can be roasted and eaten. And the plant is also used as a medicinal for memory and concentration. And the big thing that we do use it for is that it is an ornamental. So I should say that, like write that out on one of these slides, but this is an ornamental. It's commonly planted, tolerant of urban areas, can handle almost anything you throw at it. Hardy, up and through central New York. So it can be planted just about everywhere. So next I want to start with the Pinaceae family, our pine family. And as this is the family that we see the most of in central New York. These are the genera that we'll be covering: Pinus, Larix, Picea, Pseudotsuga, Tsuga, and Abies. And the only one that's not natively found in New York is Pseudotsuga. That's the Douglas fir. So the pines. There are nearly 100 species of pine around the world. We have about 40 in the United States, and they're widely distributed, both naturally and planted, but they will grow from the equator to the Arctic Circle and from sea level to the alpine tree limit. And so we find them all over the world, and they have different niches that they live in. Typically, they like open, sunny sites and well-drained soils, and many are tolerant of dry, acidic, and fertile sites. And so we often find pines growing in places where hardwoods just don't really want to grow. From a timber perspective, they're the most important timber-producing taxon or genus of the conifers. This is 2x4s, lumber, pulpwood, poles. So used to make all sorts of things. Naval stores. This is something you should be familiar with, and if you want more information, I suggest you Google it. But we extract chemicals from the bark, from the wood of pine trees and other trees, and these are called naval stores. Things like turpentine, wood tars, rosins, and they can be slashed. You can slash the bark of some of the trees and collect the sap and concentrate it, boil it down, distill it to create some of these things and other things. So these are obtained from the wood and the sap and referred to as naval stores from their military uses. As a group, pines are important from a wildlife perspective, a conservation perspective. We use them as ornamentals. They're also a food or agricultural crop. Many of you might have had pine nuts, where the pine seeds, especially the pinyon pine, which is a western pine, they're rather large, pinolas, used to make pesto. But you can buy them in little bags and just snack on them too. Botanically speaking, they have needle-shaped leaves borne in fascicles or groups of 2 to 5 typically. There is a couple single-leaved, single-needled pine trees. There's a single-leaved pinyon. But typically they will have 2 or 3 or 5. And so our white pine group will have 5 needles, and then our hard pines will have 2 or 3. If it has 4, one's probably just missing. They have cones and they have woody scales. This is kind of the classic cone that you think of. And some of them are armed. And our hard pine group, there's a hard pine group and a soft pine group. Hard pines are typically armed. They have a little prickle at the end of each of the woody scales. The hard pine group, southern pines, red pine, and then our soft pines are the white pines. We typically have a strong central leader with a terminal leader, main terminal leader, and then whorls of branches each year. And so we can kind of count how old young trees are just by how many whorls there are. So each year there's a whorl of branches that are grown, and then the leader will grow up and set buds, and then next year branches will grow there. And so you can estimate the age of these trees just by the number of whorls until they get too big and things start to disappear. Here are 2 groups of pines, our soft pines and our hard pines. Soft pines are white pines, usually have needles and fascicles of 5, and then the pinyon with the 1. They are more soft-wooded Again, we're dealing with soft-wooded trees, soft woods, conifers, gymnosperms, but there's soft softwood and hard softwood. So the white pines are softer, and typically you're not going to do things like make floors out of pines. But hard pine has a harder wood, and you will sometimes find yellow pine floors, especially in older homes. Every so often, in really old homes, you'll find white pine floors, wide board white pine floors, and they are typically in rough shape. Anyway, so hard pines, things like red pines, needles of 2 and 3, harder wood, and cones that are armed. So there are common pines, a few common pines in the Northeast: eastern white, red, jack pine, and the eastern white is really the only one that's widespread native throughout New York State. We're going to start with eastern white pine, Pinaceae pinus strobus. Here's our range. It's a northeastern tree, southern Canada, so Appalachian mountains as well, New England lake states, and a large tree. This will be one of our, or probably our largest tree in New York State, up to 200 feet tall, up to 6 feet in diameter, and this is one that's often above the canopy, dominant over the canopy of the codominant trees. And so you have the main canopy levels, and then the white pines will be sticking up above them. And before I get into the rest of the description for eastern white pine, I want to spend a moment and talk about the western white pine. The eastern white pine is the only white pine that we have in the east, and there are a handful of other ones that we have in the west. And so I just want to briefly review them so you're familiar, just in general. This is western white pine, Pinus monticola. It has kind of a smaller stature than our eastern white pine. It's still pretty tall, it's just not quite as wide. But you can see the range here. And so like a lot of our other western species, and you'll see this a lot with our conifer ranges where they are split up between the different mountain ranges. And so they'll have similar habitat requirements that are met by elevation. And so we find these in the mountains in different areas. And so that's why we have this kind of scattered range of the western white pine, Pinus monticola. This is sugar pine, Pinus lambertiana. Again, also found in the Sierras, other mountains in California and Oregon. This is the southwestern white pine, Pinus strobiformis, and it's found in southwest and northern Mexico. Pine, these are short ones at the alpine limit, tree line limit in the Sierras, and but they are also full-size trees. Don't let it confuse you. But so we find them in high elevation areas in the northwest and into southeastern Canada. White bark pine, Pinus albicollis. And this is limber pine, Pinus flexilis. This is a little more interior, but again at high elevations. And this is a close-up of the cone. So all the white pine cones look a little bit like this, and I'll show you the eastern white pine cone just a bit, but they do vary in size. And so some of them are like 5 or 6 times the size of the eastern white pine. This one is a little bit longer, but much wider, but they have these softer woody scales. They're a little bit flexible and they are unarmed. And the range here for the limber pine, a little more interior, but again, just scattered around. And if you kind of think about it, you have to wonder if these all started off as the same species, and then based on their locations, speciation happened and they ended up as different species. I mean, in theory, you would assume that would happen because they're all pines. The eastern white pine, here it is. So you can see our needles and fascicles of 5, and they're kind of a light green or bluish green. and they're soft. The white pines have a softer, fluffier look to them in general because the needles aren't quite as stiff looking. They're finer needles, and the twigs tend to be smaller and more flexible. Eastern white pines, the needles are on the tree for 2 to 3 years, and then they turn brown and fall off in that third or fourth year. And so we have usually 2 years of green needles, and then the third year in the fall, they do turn brown and drop. And so just keep that in mind. While we consider these trees to be evergreen, they're evergreen because they always have some green on them, but all of our conifers, the needles have a lifespan. And so the eastern white pine, in the third year they drop. Some of the spruces might be 6 or 7 years, but they're always going to lose some of their needles every year. Eastern white pine cone with some of those dropped needles. And you can see those flexible woody scales that are unarmed, and they often have resin on the tips of the scales, which give them kind of a whitish look. This is a very long-lived tree. There are some old growth eastern white pines in some of the swamps in central New York, and Nelson Swamp is a good example, and they can be up to 400 years old. And as they get older, they get these kind of deeply furrowed, kind of blocky bark, and it's kind of a grayish color. And this is a very typical form for one, and you can also see in this picture how big it is compared to its surrounding forest, and so they stick up above their neighbors. It has kind of a plumy, fluffy look and relatively large branches for a conifer. They are a pioneer species. So you can see here they've been seeding in, and many of our conifers are. And they can persist for a long time in the forest understory. So even they can get started, and even if the conditions aren't quite right, they can hang out until they get a gap that they can take advantage of. And so this is a seedling just growing slowly in the understory, waiting for a neighboring tree to come down and give it some space. Here's one of the old growth ones, one of those really like 400-year-old trees. You can see how blocky that bark has gotten. It's kind of flat, blocky, and grayish white. With some of our young eastern white pines, we might see damage caused by the white pine weevil, which also affects spruce trees. And so this is not an uncommon sight where the leader of the tree will be killed, and then the laterals will kind of compete for dominance, and so you end up with a multi-stemmed pine tree. And so the white pine weevil is a significant issue. It is native. It doesn't necessarily kill the tree, but it certainly makes the tree less commercially useful because it wrecks the form. So eastern white pines are found on many different sites, extremely dry, rocky, thin soils, floodplains, and sphagnum bogs. And so we find them just about every soil condition. But they do need to have a fair bit of sun to do well. And they do best on those well-drained, kind of excessively well-drained, sandy loam soils of ridges. And so even more well-drained than our typical well-drained. They have very wide-spreading, deep root systems. And we can find them in Canada, in the Canadian part of the range, growing in pure stands or mixed with red and jack pine. But typically in the U.S. and especially in like central New York, we find them mixed in with hardwoods. In the Adirondacks, we'll find them mixed with other softwoods, but usually not in a pure stand unless it's been planted. But I would say they're much more prevalent in the Adirondacks than they are here, though there are certainly areas with a lot of white pine in central New York. Much of our original eastern white pine forest is gone. They were heavily logged by the European colonists for their timber, and they were used as ships' masts, and a lot of it was sent back to England. But they're, of course, still around. They do reproduce by seed. They're an old field invader, and they can produce cones relatively early on, some as early as 5 to 10 years, but generally not until 20 to 30 years are they putting out a lot of cones. And like most trees, they have a cycle that they produce on. So every 3 to 10 years, you might have a extra crop of cones. They are fast growers. Once they're established, they can grow 4 feet a year and 1 inch in diameter every year. And so you can get a pretty good sized tree rather quickly. And intermediate tolerance. They do need sunlight, but they don't have to be in a completely open field. They can have some shade. So as I just mentioned, a lot of the white pines from the early settlers were harvested and shipped back to Europe or to England. And one of the things that they were used for were sailing masts. So we had these tall, straight poles. And so they were great for masts for sails. And there would be agents from the crown, the British crown, that would come and mark the trees that were going to be cut and shipped back to be used as sailing masts. And if you got caught cutting one of those trees, you're in significant trouble. But otherwise, typically used as lumber, 2x4s, furniture, paneling, some floors. Is a relatively soft wood. Since they grow so quickly and they grow rather large, you can get a fair bit of knot-free wood out of it. It's relatively easy to work. But most of the time we're looking at 2x4s or kind of utility furniture. Let's go over to the hard pines. Red pine. Red pine, Pinus resinosa, is a northeastern southern Canada tree, and we find it on well-drained soils, flatwoods, outcrops, dune areas, drier, sandier soils. Best growth for red pine is in upper Great Lakes. In New York, in New York, we have a pocket that's New York and Pennsylvania, and then a pocket connected to the northeast. Kind of central. That's kind of left out of the range. It is interesting. Most of the red pine we find around Morrisville are planted or naturalized, and it's strange to say that it's naturalized just outside of its historic range. Naturalized. Here's a close-up of the needles. We have needles in fascicles of 2, and they are long needles. And when you snap them, when you fold them in half, they will snap cleanly. Instead of mushing, the Austrian pine will mush when you fold the needles in half. They're the cones, these small globose cones that might have a weak prickle on them, and they're kind of stuck right to the twig of the red pine. Bark has a reddish or pinkish hue to it. We have this blocky, fissured bark. And so there's close-up on the left and a plantation on the right, plantation that should have been thinned a long time ago. So they have this reddish coloring to them. The other pines that we'll have that are native typically are not red like that. The Austrian pine, which is not native but sometimes planted in plantation, these of course are planted in plantation, in nice straight rows. So the plantation Austrian pine, some of the Austrian pine can look pinkish just to throw you off. But typically if it's pink, kind of a pinkish hue all the way on the trunk, it is our red pine. Here's a mature crown, and just comparing it to the eastern white pine. It's a little bit stiffer. It's more of like a bristle brush. It's not as plumy, a little more open. So, ecology. Intermediate tolerance, less tolerant than the eastern white pine, so it needs a little bit more sun. And it also reproduces by seed on a 3 to 7 year cycle for a bumper crop. We find this in somewhat poorer sites, acidic sites, drier sites. In Canada, it'll follow jack pine in succession, and they're often mixed together. Jack pine is an incredibly intolerant tree, and so we'll have jack pine, and then the red pine will come in and shade it out. But so they can often be mixed together. It has significant importance also as lumber, 2x4s, and other structural lumber. Telephone poles. Many of the telephone poles across the country are made of red pine. The wood is relatively durable and it is relatively straight and tall, and so useful for telephone poles. And conversely, used for making log cabins as well as pulp. It was used for Christmas trees. It's not really used for Christmas trees much anymore. And white pine is also used for Christmas trees, but kind of a very niche market since the branches are soft. So you might find red pine used occasionally as a Christmas tree. And it is used ornamentally, but in a limited scope. Jack pine is for next. One, Pinus banksiana. And jack pine is a very northern pine. We have it in kind of extant populations in New York and some small pockets in New England. It does drop down into the Lake States, but it's primarily a Canadian tree. But this is the most widely distributed pine tree in Canada. It goes from one coast almost all the way to the other. And this tree is really recognizable. It has these short needles, just a couple inches long typically, and they're usually twisted and they point out away. Most of our pine needles, when you push them together, they form a cylinder. They kind of are neat looking, but the jack pine kind of looks like it's been shocked or something. They kind of fray out. And we have these cones that can retain on the tree for 20 years and that without even opening. You'll often find open dead cones on trees that are just kind of stuck, but you'll find jack pine cones that have been on for many years that haven't opened yet, and they're still viable and just kind of waiting to open. And they're small and hard, and they look like they're literally stuck to the tree. This is a juvenile cone. It's actually on the female cone is on the right. They're green, and then the male pollen cones are there on the left. They kind of look like caterpillars, but those are the pollen cones that are releasing pollen, looking for the female cones. Here is a close-up of some open cones and maturing cones, and so the green ones are still maturing, and they have this kind of crescent shape to them. You can see the base of them stuck right to the twig, and they kind of curl out away from the twig, kind of like the needles. When they're open, that crescent shape isn't quite as obvious, but they will still be stuck right to the tree. And they're not very big, 1.5 to 2.5 inches. We find this tree on poor sites, sterile, well-drained, sandy, acidic. This is a tree that is definitely a niche species. It's a pioneer. We'll find it with in pure stands or mixed with red pine. We will find it on better sites, and it grows. The form of the tree is better on better sites, but it's often outcompeted by other trees on those sites. Very intolerant. It does not handle shade. It's quickly or somewhat quickly outcompeted by red pine. But we will find with other very intolerant trees like birch, aspen, and other pines. Also a rapid growing, short-lived tree. Most of our rapid growing trees are short-lived, and it will produce cones when it's just 3 years old or 15 years old, and somewhere in between there. So it produces cones very early on, and it reproduces by seed following fire. And so the adaptation is that those cones need heat to open. That's why they can hang out on the twigs for such a long time. And once heat comes through and opens them up, they will disperse. And so the adaptation is that a fire will go through, clear out the understory, kind of melt the resin off the cone, allow it to open and drop the seeds. Those seeds will then drop and land in the soil and start to grow. This is a young jack pine covered with pollen cones and a few female cones as well. So this is reproducing, and it's only about 10 or 12 years old. This is a significant pulpwood species. especially in Canada. It's also used for lumber, railroad ties, and utility poles. And it's important for wildlife. There's a particular bird called the Kirtland's warbler, which only nests in jack pine stands that are greater than 72 acres in size in trees that are that are up to 18 feet high. So shorter trees in pure stands of jack pine that are at least 72 acres in size. And so if that is not a niche species, I don't know what is. Our next hard pine in the Northeast is pitch pine, which is Pinus rigida. So pitch pine is found in pockets of New York State, more so in slightly warmer areas in the Northeast and into the Mid-Atlantic and the Appalachian Mountains. And we typically, especially find pitch pine growing in pine barrens areas. We also find it growing in wet, boggy sites. I should have mentioned that with the jack pine. The jack pine can grow in wet sites as well as in dry sites. So we have coastal, peaty instances of the pine as well as the dry pine barren areas. Pitch pines reproduce by seed at a relatively early age, 12 years old. Some of the cones are forgotten. Heat will burn from the fire, not all the cones are forgotten. You don't necessarily need fire, it's not necessarily a fire dependent. The growth, the size, shape of the tree, and its long fashion is dependent on the site, whether it's a dry site or a wetter site, and where it is. It is an intolerant pioneer species. This was the first species in the Northeast that was used for naval stores, especially in pitch pine. So we were able to extract from the bark and wood of this tree. And it's also important because it plays a major role on foresights by stabilizing soils and providing site occupancy, provides wildlife habitat. This is just a fun fact. The Audubon Field Guide lists this. The pine knots from the pitch pine, when fastened to a pole and lit on fire, can serve as torches at night. They have enough flammability in them that they can just be lit on fire. The mature pitch pine, and it has needles and fascicles of 3. And it has kind of a fuzzy look to it overall. And part of the reason for that is because it's one of the few pine trees that have apicormic sprouts. And so we'll have these shoots, these little twigs or sprouts that come off of the main trunk and that support needles. And sometimes the needles grow right out of the trunk or the main branches. Typically speaking, most other conifers don't really do this, or most other pines don't do this. And so if you see a pine tree that has little tiny branches all over the trunk that have significant amount of needles on them, it's most likely a pitch pine. So these sprouts are also a fire adapted response so that the other limbs or the canopy of the tree can be killed off and then it will push out these sprouts and the tree will continue to grow. The cone, again, a small cone. Um, the woody scales of the cone are armed with kind of these weak prickle. That surface is called an umbo, just for reference. I want to go over relatively quickly some of the other pines that we might find across the country. I am not going to be able to cover all of the pines that we have, but I want to just hit on some of the important ones and interesting ones. So know that there are others that we're not covering, but you can go just look them up and report on them or read more about them. I'm going to talk about longleaf pine and loblolly pine. Longleaf pine is Pinus palustris. Pinus palustris is an important pine in the southeast, very much a southeast coastal plain or Piedmont tree, relatively limited native range. Longleaf pine lives in some variable habitats, fern sites or fern drain sites, but does best on those well-drained sandy soil. And this is a fire adapted tree and has some really interesting adaptations because of it. And so the longleaf pine starts off as a seedling, like all trees do. And one of the first things it does is put down a big taproot. And at this point, the seedling doesn't really grow that much. And you can see the long leaves, the long needles, hence its name. And when it's in this stage, we call it the grass stage because it kind of looks like a mound of grass. But you can see that big white bud in the middle there. And this is what we call a fire-resistant clump because it's growing that big taproot that can resprout if it is killed by fire. And it can stay like this for 3 to 6 years or sometimes up to 20 years. And the idea is that there's going to be a surface fire that goes through periodically and clears out the competing vegetation around it and giving it room to grow and will be released. So at this stage, it's focusing on root growth. And then once it's released, or if it just grows, um, they will grow. They're good sized trees. They're used for lumber. But this is a close up of the needles, and the individual needle can be up to 18 inches long. Another one of our southeastern pines is the loblolly pine. And there are 4 southeastern pines that are kind of as a group referred to as the southern yellow pine. And loblolly is by far the most important, commercially most important of them. It's Pinus tata. So the most important timber species in the southeast, 50% of the U.S. pulpwood from southern pines is mostly loblolly. So of the species of southern pines, 50% of the pulpwood comes from southern pines, and most of that is loblolly. It's also used for plywood and veneer. And loblolly pine and some of the other ones are grown like crops, like corn. They're grown in short rotation in plantations. They're heavily fertilized, they're weeded, they're pruned. They're growing wood quickly. And so plantation forestry in the southeast is very different than growing wood out of northern hardwoods in New York State. So just know that they are kind of intensely managed. They can also be on variable sites, either wet or dry, but do best in coastal plain sites where they have plenty of moisture. They are an old field pioneer. They're relatively aggressive, and natively we can find them in pure stands. Just want to go over a couple of our western pines. There are more than this, but we're just picking a couple. First one is ponderosa pine. Ponderosa pine is a large pine with relatively wide distribution throughout the West. Again, it's going to be in those higher elevation locations and where the sites are conducive. Ponderosa pine grow in savanna-like areas, and they can be really large trees, multiple feet in diameter, over 200 feet tall. And this is the most important pine in Western North America, and they have lots of commercial quantities of this tree in the West. And so often when you're managing for managing pines in the West, you might be managing ponderosa. The other one is lodgepole pine, which we're not really going over today, but these are large trees. They have kind of reddish, orangey bark, and they often, this picture here, you can see there's a road going through it, but this is very typical where they kind of live in this grassy, open area. Next is the Great Basin bristlecone pine, Pinus longeva, and this is a really fascinating tree. These are one of the oldest of all trees, over 4,000 years old. Certain individuals, 4,000 years old, and they live in these incredibly harsh, dry environments in the Southwest at high elevations. You've probably seen pictures of them. This is a typical example where the tree is mostly dead. But parts of the tree have just been hanging on and new parts develop. And so this tree, is thousands of years old. And this is part of Great Basin National Park. So many of these trees are in protected areas. And they have this fantastic form. And they're not really big. This one's wide as it's, kind of grew multiple um, facets over the millennia, but they're not giant trees. They're this kind of this weather-beaten trees, but very old. I've not seen these in person yet, and this is on my bucket list. A couple of exotic pines that we have here in New York: Scotch pine and Austrian pine. Scotch pine, just Pinus sylvestris. This is the form of a mature tree, and it's got very recognizable bark where we have this flaky orangey red bark for the top half or top 2/3 of the tree. And compare that to the red pine, which is kind of a pinkish cast all the way down on kind of a gray bark. This has this flaky bark that's bright colored at the top half of the tree. The bottom of the tree is kind of blocky and darker. Some of them can have good form, some of them can have really poor form depending on the genetics. Some of the trees that were imported or were used for breeding had really bad form, and so we have some populations or some plantations of Scotch pine, and all the trees are gnarly and kind of. I mean, they're not terrible, but they're definitely not really good for straight poles or lots of timber. Um, and they kind of have an open canopy. This is the native range of the Scotch pine, and all those little E's there, that's where it was extirpated. And this map is kind of centered on Russia, but those little E's in the top left there, that's the United Kingdom, Ireland, and France. So this tree used to go all the way through Europe, and it goes all the way through Asia, and much of the forests of Europe are Pinus sylvestris or Scotch pine. And interestingly enough, in Scotland, where you can see there are still some populations, some forests there, they call it Caledonian pine. But this tree is incredibly common in Europe and is a staple of the forest. And typically they have better genetics there. But the widest range of any pine tree. Here's a close-up of the needles. They have these paired needles, usually twisted a little bit, not quite as gnarly looking as jack pine. Jack pine needles are also a little bit flattened, and these ones are still round. And these small kind of pyramidal shaped cones with raised scales, um, small cones, and then that orange flaky bark, they're pretty easy to identify. So the most widely distributed pine in the world, it's naturalized in the US and Canada, as well as planted. It used to be used for Christmas trees, but really not that much anymore. Um, where we do have it, we use it mostly for pulpwood, but it can be used for erosion control and as an ornamental, and it does best on very well drained soils. That orangey red bark, tends to be a great ornamental characteristic, and the fact that sometimes the form isn't that good really adds to its ornamental value. I like it when they're kind of gnarly and not that straight. The other one, Austrian pine, Pinus nigra. Here's a plantation in Europe. So Austrian pine is another European pine. And the form, the needles, the cones, this tree looks like red pine, except most of the time the bark is black. And so Austrian pine, it's also called black pine, the name Pinus nigra. But this is a typical plantation of it. One of the big differences when you're trying to key it out, typically the bark is grayish or blackish, but sometimes it can be pinkish like red pine. But the needles don't snap. When you fold them in half, they just kind of mush. The red pine, Pinus resinosa, they snap cleanly. Close up of those needles and the big white buds that they have. The buds are covered in resin. They're actually orange. but they're resin colored. So typically they look white, and the long paired needles in groups of 2. Here's a form of one. They're sometimes the stouter tree than the red pine. And here's a close-up of the bark. And you can kind of see how it has like a pink tendency, but typically gray, blocky. So they can be used for lumber. We do put them in plantations for timber purposes, but often or pulp purposes. So they are grown for product. They have a particular problem where they're susceptible to this needle blight called Dothostroma, which has really reduced their value in the U.S. And so we used to use them as an ornamental a lot, and campus used to have dozens of them, but we only have one left, and Dothostroma has really done them in. So this wraps up the pine presentation. We'll be covering the rest of the Pinaceae family in the next presentation. But just remember that this is a fraction of all the pines that we have, or a sampling.